Tonight, on a special last of the year edition of Washington Week, we'll take Donald Trump both seriously and literally and discuss what a second Trump term could look like. He's already told us what he's planning for January 20th, of course.
I said I want to be a dictator for one day.
We'll talk about the presumptive GOP frontrunners' plans and dreams and what they can mean for America and the world. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket.
Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular,
You get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing.
have a nice day.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening, and welcome to a very special episode of Washington Week with The Atlantic. And I really mean with The Atlantic, as you will soon see. Tonight, for our last show of the year, we're going to talk about Donald Trump, his record, his campaign, and the promises he's made. We just published a special issue of The Atlantic devoted to answering the question, what will happen if Trump wins? In this issue, 24 of our writers look at Trump's record in domestic and foreign policy, the economy, and national security. And we have a number of those writers with us tonight. McKay Coppins, who in addition to being a staff writer, is the author of Romney, A Reckoning. Franklin Foer, whose last book is The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, and also a staff writer. And Adrienne LaFrance, our esteemed executive editor. Esteemed. I put that in there special.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Welcome, Atlantic team. Yeah, it's an Atlantic takeover. What do you?
Thank you, boss.
We've launched a coup, and here we are. So yes, we have this issue. I hope you at home have a copy of this. You can buy it, find it online, do whatever you want. It's a free country, we think. And we decided a while ago that we thought, as Trump became clear that Trump was going to become the nominee, and I think we're all sort of there, that there's not a lot in the way right now. There's the Colorado business, but we'll put that aside for the moment. We decided that we really should examine everything we know about Trump and everything based on what we know from the first term, how the second term could go. Adrienne, let me just start with you, just to give why don't you give us the overarching core argument of the reason for the issue?
Right. So I think the first two things I would say are what you alluded to, which is this, conveying to people that this really could happen. He really could be president again. He's the presumptive nominee. And then really deeply exploring through reporting, through an examination of the recent historic record, what the next term could be like, and helping people understand that, it may be and likely will be different, and the ways in which they're different really lay out the stakes for what that means.
Is different a euphemism for worse?
I think it is. Yes, I mean worse if you don't like authoritarianism. so I mean that quite seriously. Is if when you read this package, you're left with the really clear sense of this is what it will be like or could be like to experience the realization of authoritarianism in America, and that is not something that is just hypothetical, that it's a real danger. I mean, your editor's note in the issue is called a warning, and it really is a warning.
Just stay on this for one more second, because I want to have clarity on this. This is not about conservative policies or Republican, what we think of as traditional Republican policies on taxes, social welfare issues.
Exactly.
So what is the split here?
Right.
How did, as you were involved in this, how did you think about this?
No, this is really important. I'm glad you asked that. It's not about right versus left. It is absolutely not an issue about why people should support Democrats or Biden. It's about what America looks like if it is a democracy or if it is under authoritarian rule. And the notion being that we want to remain free and that Trump becoming president again would make that very, very difficult. And so it's not about right versus left. It's not about policy even really at all. It's about the rise of authoritarianism in America.
Right. McKay, let me go to you. Obviously, in addition to spending all this time recently with, I guess you would call Mitt Romney Donald Trump's most prominent Republican critic. Certainly, he's gone as far out there as anyone except Liz Cheney. And they're probably a duopoly or something. You've also known Donald Trump probably the longest of anyone at this table. How has he changed? Tell us first how you met him, and second, how he's changed.
So I profiled him in early 2014, actually, when he was still talking about running for governor of New York. And the idea of the presidency was sort of, it was like a PR stunt. He was always talking about running. And I accidentally, after a series of kind of travel mishaps, ended up spending a couple days with him at Mar-a-Lago. And the piece that I wrote back then, almost 10 years ago now, sort of, I think it holds up in a lot of ways, except with the notable exception that I predicted very confidently he would never run for president. But the portrait.
But we admire the confidence.
I bring that same confidence to work every day at the Atlantic now. No, but I mean, look, the portrait I think holds up in that back then, a decade ago, the thing that came through is he was incredibly, and this was surprised me at the time, incredibly needy, was constantly in search of validation. He was desperate for respect from, at the time, kind of elite political circles that saw him as a joke. And I think that his kind of sense of personal grievance and, frankly, need for revenge against the elites who were constantly holding him in disdain, ridiculing him, making fun of him, has powered everything that came after that.
So even back then, he needed your respect?
I was a 25-year-old BuzzFeed writer, and he was desperate for my validation and approval. He was constantly asking me questions like, isn't this plane pretty impressive? What do you think of Mar-a-Lago? I would be a pretty good candidate, don't you think? It was like fishing for compliments, which surprised me because at the time I knew him primarily as the Celebrity Apprentice host, and the guy he plays on TV is this very confident guy. I think we've all seen that, that kind of very needy ego in the 10 years since.
But at the time,
the insecurity surprised me.
And the insecurity, I want to stay with you for a minute, because the insecurity is interesting because it forces him or creates in him a need to surround himself with yes men and yes women. I want to read something from your article in this issue, which has to do with the type of person he would hire should he become president again. One job that Trump will be especially focused on getting right is Attorney General. He believes that both of the men who held this position during his term, Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, were guilty of grievous betrayal. Trump has pledged to use the Justice Department to visit revenge on his persecutors if he returns to the White House. So go into that a little bit. What would be the difference from your analysis between the first term that we experienced and a theoretical second term?
So I think that insecurity that we were alluding to led in the first term to Trump being sort of giddy about all these important credentialed Republicans who were willing to work for him in his first administration. William Barr was a serious guy. He had a long history in a Republican legal world. And the fact that he and people like Gary Cohn or John Kelly or James Mattis were willing to join his administration was a source of enormous pride. So he let all these people in addition to the Steve Bannons and Stephen Millers, right? What I've been told talking to people in Trump's orbit is that would not happen in a second term. He would prize obedience above credentials and above everything else. So with the Attorney General, for example, the names that I hear are Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Mike Lee from the Senate. Another one was Jeffrey Clark, the former Assistant Attorney General, who's now indicted in the Georgia racketeering case. So these are people who Trump believes would do exactly what he tells them to do, rather than seeking to sort of thread the needle between Trump's orders and precedent or norms.
Right. So no more grown-ups in the
That's
room.
right.
The so-called grown-ups would not be there. it would be just the hardcore.
Both because he doesn't want any more so-called adults in the room, and also because, frankly, a lot of those adults in the room didn't fare very well in the first
Right,
term.
and we have an extraordinary collection of quotes from people who worked for him.
Yes.
Directly in high, who say that he's completely unqualified to be president. It's not Democrats we're quoting, it's Republicans.
A very small number of his, I think it's 44 cabinet officials from the first term, have endorsed his reelection.
Right.
I think that tells you a lot about what they think of him.
Frank, I want to turn to you and your piece, which has to do with the issue of corruption. I want to just read a quick quote from that. If the first Trump presidency was, for the most part, an improvised exercise in petty corruption, a second would likely consist of systematic abuse of the government. There's a term to describe this sort of regime that might emerge on the other side, a mafia state. That's a heavy accusation. What do you think this mafia state would look like?
It's a term that comes from Hungary, and Viktor Orban transformed the Hungarian government. I think when you talk about the ways that this time will be different, there's a quote that always rings in my head from the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman. He described the first Trump administration as malevolence tempered by incompetence. And so there was a lot of stuff that was happening that was trial and error in that first term, where he was testing the limits. A lot of them were the limits of what his fellow Republicans would be willing to tolerate. He didn't know if the type of petty corruption he was engaged in would just get a free pass, or if it would be something that would earn the reprimand. And so he tested the limits, and he found out basically that there were no limits. And so headed into this second term, you have people who've thought much more deliberately about how to structure what they call the administrative state. And one of the things that comes up in a lot of these articles in this issue is that there's this goal of implementing something called Schedule F, which is that you would purge you're not just talking about the cabinet appointees or the political appointees, but the civil service, the bureaucrats who populate what Trump disparagingly referred to as the deep state. And so if you take these experts, you take these people who've been committed to lifelong careers in government, and you replace them with essentially the hacks who've passed some sort of Trump loyalty test, they're going to be committed to this larger project of corruption. They're not beholden to any of these other ideals. They're beholden to a leader, and also just the nature of the people who would be attracted to those types of jobs are people who are going to want to line their own pocket, just given their ideals. And so you start to have the state that is systematically corrupt, not just corrupt in places.
Right, but our David Frum, our staff writer, has written on this issue and said that in the first iteration, the first go around, the petty corruption, the greed actually tempered the kind of authoritarian effectiveness, if you will. You think something's going to be different there? The revenge is going to take, revenge and power are going to be more salient than the desire just to build more hotels or whatever it is that motivates?
I don't see these things as being fundamentally philosophically inconsistent, that you'll have at the highest level revenge being exacted against political opponents, and then kind of in a more systematic way, more petty sort of way, it won't just be that you'll have people trying to influence policy, buying rooms at the Trump hotels. You're going to have people who are going to be distributing government contracts to their friends. You're going to have the ways in which what Hungary suggests is that you'll have very systematic parts of the economy be handed over in very subtle sort of ways to people who are loyalists.
Right. I want to come back to both these subjects. I want to turn to Clint for a second. And by the way, I want to acknowledge that December was Beard Month at the Atlantic. It's the little part of my authoritarian reign, mandatory beards in December.
I'm rebelling.
Yeah, and Adrienne was exempt because of her high status.
Maybe you'll give us bonuses and allow us to cover the razors.
Yeah, that's right. If I only paid you more, you'd have razors. Clint, I want to talk about, Clint, your piece is a kind of a profound piece. It's a meditation on sort of the nature of the entire MAGA project, Make America Great Again, with the emphasis on the most important word in that formula. I want to read something that you wrote in this issue. The most patriotic education is one that demands that we sit with the totality and complexity and moral inconsistencies of the American project. Trumpism seeks to censor attempts to tell this sort of story. Trump says that he will double down on this effort if reelected. History has taught us that we should believe him. Then you went on to write, His most enduring slogan, Make America Great Again, is an unsubtle pledge to restore just such an order. Trump rode that pledge to power in 2016. Now running for a second term, he has promised yet more: to impose his harmful, erroneous historical claims on school curricula and to instill a culture of fear in classrooms across the country that dare to deviate from his preferred historical narrative. Now, our colleague Yoni Applebaum has written in the recent past about this unsupervised or unregulated experiment that we're all undergoing, the movement of a large-sized democracy from one group domination to a more multicultural kind of environment. And, obviously it's been your view, and you've expressed this, that Make America Great Again is a reaction to this kind of change. Talk about what you see as the core of the Trump project, and if you think that from the issues that concern you the most, if he's going to be more effective if he becomes president again.
Yeah, I think Trump is somebody who fundamentally rejects the idea that we should hold complexity, hold fullness, hold multidimensionality together, right? And when it comes to American history, when it comes to American education, we recognize, I think, here at The Atlantic, that America is a place that has provided unparalleled opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And you have to hold both of those realities when you consider the totality and the history of the American project. But Trump and the sort of MAGA movement rejects the idea that we should even name or acknowledge or incorporate analysis of the things that include violence, include oppression, include parts of the American story that don't fully align with a very specific notion of America as being a singular beacon on a hill that is upon whom no aspersion should be cast, and that goes to the way that we talk about the founders, right? And, and so much of the way that Trump spoke about history was animated by a rejection of a lot of what we've been wrestling with here at The Atlantic, and then perhaps most notably the New York Times 1619 Project. And he rejected that premise so much that we should wrestle with the complexity of the founding and the founders, that in the way that the sort of 1619 Project and a lot of our pieces illustrate, that he created a 1776 commission toward the end of his presidency, specifically with the intention to suggest that teachers should only be teaching a patriotic education. And what patriotic means to him is that you only focus on the sort of dominant narrative that has been central to the way that we've told the story of American history for many years.
Right. There's an argument, of course, that the dominant narrative or the dominant direction is from the founding documents. So we're trying to build a more perfect union. The clear implication of seeking a more perfect union is the union is imperfect. And so the interesting thing, I can live with that, and we obviously at The Atlantic believe that the American project is worthwhile and democracy is worthwhile, and that the story of America is a story of getting better. But what is it about the age we're in that created such a kind of brittleness that doesn't allow for people to say, yeah, we did good things and we did bad things, and we have to talk about all of them, including in school?
Yeah, I think part of it is it's a range of factors, but I think a big part of it is that over the last 10 years with the Black Lives Matter movement, when we think specifically about the history of race and racism in this country, it is made clear for millions of people across this country that we have to analyze our understanding and make sense of American history in a way that is much more sophisticated, much more complex than we previously have, and that our previous conceptions of what was or was not racist or what was or was not oppressive have expanded necessarily, and there's a sort of structural analysis, there's a systemic analysis, and what that means is that now you have many more people who are telling a fuller, more honest, more complex story of America. You know, Yoni talked about how we're trying to incorporate a range of different stories and a range of different communities, and I think when you begin to include those stories that complicate some of the previous narratives that have existed, in America. For example, Thomas Jefferson, I write a lot in my book about going to Monticello, and one of the things that docents and public historians at Monticello struggle with is that there's so many people who show up to Monticello who don't want to accept even the very fact that Thomas Jefferson owned enslaved people, right? When we know that Thomas Jefferson owned 600 enslaved people, don't want to accept that Thomas Jefferson was somebody who enslaved his own children, which we know that he did. But part of that is because Jefferson represents, is a sort of personification of a story of America that told them that America is all good and that we shouldn't wrestle with the things that aren't good about America or about Jefferson or our founding. And so Trump would have us not talk about those things, even though those things are essential to understanding the landscape of contemporary inequality today.
Right, right. Adrienne, I want to ask you a journalism question. And the journalism question is one that we've struggled with on this show, in the Atlantic, all across the media, which is there's a portion of the country, a large portion of the country, that we believe isn't completely tethered to reality and fact-based discourse. Obviously, the leader of that group, Donald Trump, is someone who lies freely and often and ostentatiously. But I don't want to act as if the quote-unquote mainstream media is anything close to perfect. It's an imperfect union. It's an imperfect media. How did we get to the place where all of this amazing reporting over the last 8 years by The Atlantic, by everyone from the New York Times and the Washington Post to the networks, to CNN, et cetera, how did it come to pass that this reporting, unrefuted reporting, didn't affect the way millions and millions of people see him? And what does it say about us, and what does it say about those people who feel left behind by whatever is going on in this country?
I think there are a bunch of ways you can answer that question. And I would start with, you think about sort of the unshakable base that he has. And so there is some degree to which, and it, I think is probably related to why people like him in the first place, but whatever it is, and whether it's his charisma, whether it's his, tapping into certain grievances, legitimate or not, his bombast, whatever it is that makes people drawn to him is solid for that base. And so that is just like, that's one piece of it. I think the other pieces, in terms of like the journalism part of it, this goes into the decline of faith in institutions generally, which is its own large story. Journalism as an institution is certainly one of the places where we've seen declining trust in America and around the world to some extent. And then, of course, looking at the informational environment, I think the way that people come to different news stories, or it's just with the social web in particular, it's chaos, right? And so people don't know what to trust, and they have their tribes and their places where they can get snap reactions that validate their opinions, and so we're just simply not in an environment, informationally or culturally, where we're making it easy for people to believe truth, despite our best efforts as journalists. And so it's just, I would say it's just a really chaotic time.
Right. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask you all a pretty basic question. We see that he has an obvious path to the nomination. Do you think that he has an obvious path to the presidency?
Yes, he absolutely does. But there's also a lot of factors, as people have noted, that we just don't know what's going to happen with the trials and the different court cases. And obviously, Colorado is an example of some of the things that we're going to be thinking about and talking about. So yes, but with an asterisk.
Yes.
You're an obvious expert on what he's going to do.
Well, yeah, let me confidently predict the outcome of the election.
Bring your confidence.
No, look, I think that in the nature of our country now is that it's hyper-polarized, and any presidential election is at least reasonably close. I also think that, 2020 was not a landslide victory for Joe Biden by any stretch. It was also taking place in a uncommonly tumultuous year in American democracy between the George Floyd protests, the pandemic, the bungled response from the Trump administration. I think that this is now not just about Trump, it's about Biden, and I think it's a jump ball.
Right. Frank, 20 seconds. If Donald Trump loses, does he march on the White House anyway to try to take it back?
That's what the pattern of his past behavior seems to suggest, that for all of the character flaws that McKay diagnosed, it's the very reason why he's incapable of accepting defeat.
Well, unfortunately, we need to leave it there for now. I guess we'll have to wait till next year to find out what happens. I want to thank my Atlanta colleagues, our 3 staff writers here, and Adrienne LaFrance, our executive editor, for sharing your insight and reporting. And for much more on what a second Trump term could look like, be sure to check out theatlantic.com. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night and Happy New Year from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by
Consumer Cellular, this is Sam.
How may I help you?
This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket.
Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular,
You get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing.
have a nice day.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.